Good afternoon. My name is Steve Hallman. I'm Marketing Director for Magna's Body and Chassis Group, and today I'm also SAA President. I'd like to thank you everybody for joining us today for our first webinar with the Ipsos Disruption Series. Last year on the board, we discussed that there's a little bit of a white space in our programming and our membership relative to the voice of the consumer. And we're really pleased to have Ipsos as a sponsor and providing this webinar series for our members and even non-members. So we're really excited to have them on board and also really excited to have a lot of new attendees to our events. We may have hit the 200 mark for registrations today. I hope we did, but that's great. Nice to see a lot of new people in the scope of our presentation. So if we go to the next slide, just for those people who aren't terribly familiar with the SAA, we are a networking organization and we provide a lot of programming and access to different people in the industry. Our membership varies from data providers, OEM members, suppliers, technology providers, all sorts of, really, if it's an analytics sort of capability or role, they're probably members with us. So today we have, I think, half of our registrants today were from OEMs, about a little over a third were from auto suppliers, and then various other consultants and information providers after that. So we have a great cross-section today, and I'm really excited about that. For the next slide, just a quick preview of the upcoming third of our disruption series from Ipsos. On July 17th at noon, we'll do another webinar talking about driving technology. And then on November 12th, we'll get into shared mobility. So by registering for today's event, you're automatically registered for those. But feel free, if you like what you see today, share it with your friends, and share the registration information, get them to go sign up. We'd like to get the word out even wider if at all possible. For upcoming member events, a few weeks ago at one of our events, I mentioned that we had 7 events coming up in 6 weeks, so we're halfway through that. On May 22nd, next week, we've got a coffee break with Foley and Lardner about, from a legal perspective, dealing with the shifting timing of EV programs. Plant Moran's doing a webinar on June 12th, and then we have June 20th. It was a first time we've gone to CareSoft in Livonia last year. It nearly sold out. I guess you can't really sell at that place, it's so big, but it was a huge attendance. For those not familiar, they do teardowns of vehicles and benchmarking. So this year we're going to feature some electric vehicles coming in from China. I know they are currently or have already torn down a Tesla Cybertruck. So I got a chance to go see that. It was pretty cool. Moving right along back to our sponsors. None of this would be possible without our sponsors. Like I mentioned that Ipsos joined recently, but we have a great, very supportive set of sponsors that help us out with getting facilities, finding speakers, and just general networking. They just really, really are very helpful to us, and we really appreciate their continued support. Moving on to today's program, I'd like to welcome Renee Slocum, Strategic Senior Insights Consultant with Ipsos, and Graham Gordon, Director at Ipsos. So thank you for joining us today. I'm going to throw it over to them. You're on mute, Graham.
Oh, good start, huh? Thank you, Steve, and thank you everyone for joining. As he mentioned, my name is Graham Gordon. This is Renee Slocum is also joining me. We are part of the Ipsos Automotive Mobility and Development team. Also behind the scenes on our side is Mike Van Newkirk. He is our automotive client officer here at Ipsos. So if you have any curiosities or interest in our work, he's definitely the guy to reach out to. And he's also a board member at SAA, so he's good people. We're going to hear from him at the end, as he's going to be monitoring the chat today for our little Q&A at the end. So please drop any questions or comments that you have in the chat, and then we'll either address them at the end of this presentation or afterwards via email. Today, we're going to be digging into a ton of consumer insights. So I think we can just get started. And actually, before we start, I think we need a quick recap on the type of technology that we're going to be talking about today. Because when we talk about electrification, we're actually talking about three main types of powertrains, three innovations beyond the standard internal combustion engine. Number one, we're going to be looking at hybrids or HEVs. These are an electric motor attached to the gas engine of a vehicle. You don't necessarily plug it in, but it's something that helps with fuel efficiency and the acceleration of the vehicle. We're going to be looking at plug-in hybrids or PHEVs. These are plugged in, and you're going to get a short electric-only range for those kind of shorter trips with a backup gas engine once that range depletes. And then lastly, we have battery electric vehicles or BEVs, right? These are the kind of end goal of electrification. This is a vehicle that's completely powered by an electric motor that, again, has to be plugged in to charge. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get into what we're actually going to be talking about. We want to start off by providing some context, right? First, what we're seeing in the news, and then second, about how we're going to analyze the data using these two Ipsos data sources. After that, within sections 3 and 4, we're going to look at how these two studies are dissecting the current landscape of EV adoption, and then we're going to be looking at the ownership and purchase process and what the main barriers are. Now, sections 3 and 4 may be news to some, it might be a recap for others, but I want to set the stage and I want to make sure that everyone is informed on a level playing field. I think where things are going to get interesting is we've got 2 actionable items for 5 and 6. Number 5 is going to be talking about how to kind of course correct with current and future BEV options. And this end piece, number 6, I think is going to be the most important one. How can we use electrified powertrains to set us up for success? There's some really interesting stuff in those last 2 parts, but first, again, I just want to set the stage. So Renee, start us off. What are you seeing in the news?
Yeah, so thanks, Graham. BEVs are all over the news, and often the headlines are like themes, that the media latches onto, like range anxiety, battery life, charging station availability. And on the policy side, most recently, the administration increased tariffs on Chinese EVs and the batteries in the hopes of protecting the US industries. It's a constantly evolving landscape. Even as the presence of BEVs increases on the road and improvements in range, occur. But lately, the headlines still haven't been great. Recently, we read that the $7.5 billion investment as part of the Inflation Reduction Act has only resulted in 7 charging stations over the past 2 years. So this alarms buyers, and rightly so. Next to our homes, vehicles are the biggest purchases that we make. And people are wondering if they can rely on the government promise that the infrastructures are going to be there when they need them. So the masses are not about to rely on a government program to ensure the BEVs are going to work for them. And this slowing of interest is forcing the automakers to make some tough decisions. And all of this plays into the consumer's mind when they purchase the vehicle.
Yeah, I think one thing that's important to note is that these headlines are literally coming in every day. I even find it daunting to stay informed day in and day out because there's a lot of players and they all have a lot at stake and they're all making different announcements and adjustments. So just know that, a lot of this is a moving target.
Sure. So yeah, speaking of moving targets, initially the projections by the EPA for EVs were that they were going to be 67% of new vehicle sales by the 2030-2032 model year. But recently those expectations shifted and the new projections are like a wide range, 30% to 56%. So there's been a reality check here about what's even possible. And the EPA is stating this large range rather than settling on a hard, fast percentage like they were before. And this shift away from optimism and excitement is impacting even the giants like Tesla, not to mention the startups and the traditional OEMs. They're all having to make changes in productions in order to line up with what the customers want. So the situation is sort of a conundrum. We have the government setting standards for the automakers and providing the funding to try to break down the barriers, but they're having limited success. And ultimately, it's the consumers that drive adoption, of course. All right, so let's take a look at some good news.
Yes, because I think that there's some tough pills that the industry has had to swallow, but we are seeing progress, right? For one, BEV market share increased from 2022 to 2023, and that's, the full year market share percentage. And apart from a blip that we had in February, we're still seeing steady growth. And while we're not necessarily hitting certain milestones that we had from before, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't applaud the milestones that we have actually achieved, like that middle number, the 1 million BEVs sold in 2023. That's the first time that we've hit 7 figures. And then, of course, I think there's still things to look forward to in the BEV space, right? There's going to be lineup shifts and there's going to be cancellations, but that 70 plus number of estimated BEV options is still worth feeling optimistic about, both from an availability standpoint and from consumer choice standpoint. And these are the next generation of BEVs too, right? This isn't like their first foray into it. We're now looking at platforms that are a bit more established. So if you're feeling optimistic, these wrinkles can be ironed out from each of these OEMs as they establish themselves in that BEV space.
Sure, we're going to see dozens of new models roll out even before the end of this year. And some of those will be at the lower end, which could help people find the vehicle that fits them.
That's right. And then on the government side, they're still hard at work to boost electrification in the industry. But what I want to point out is it's not just incentives and price decreases that I think are top of mind for people and making headlines. It's this all-encompassing thing. It's boosting the American economy in the sector and working through infrastructure. So when we're talking about the front-facing impact 1 year in, I think a lot of people look at dollars off of a sticker price and a few charging stations. And while the scrutiny that you had mentioned before is valid, we got to highlight that there's way more to it than that. There's a lot of different endeavors that is this overarching idea of promoting electrification.
Yeah, so those payoffs might be down the road.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so on to the data. We're going to start by giving a brief overview of the 2 studies that we're looking at today. I'll be highlighting NVCS, that's the New Vehicle Customer Study. It's the largest automotive study in the industry. It is a syndicated study, and we get over 200,000 returns each year, which include all makes and models except for the very high-end, low-volume vehicles. We survey at 2 to 3 months in service through a quota sample, and then we weight it to vehicle sales so that our database reflects a total market mix of vehicles. This study's been fielding continuously for over 50 years. It's primarily a buyer behavior study, but we capture everything that goes into the purchase of a vehicle, including purchase reasons, consideration, avoidance, what else is in the garage, loyalty, defection, personal and vehicle attitudes, and a whole lot more.
The study I'll be talking about is a bit different than yours. My data is coming from our Navigator syndicated study. This study is annually fielded, and it's actually part of a 3-module study, right? The first one, which we're talking about today, is on electrification, and then the other 2 are about driving technology and autonomous driving, and our third is about shared mobility. It's a multi-market study, but today we're going to be sticking to U.S. insights, and we're looking at the responses from 2,000 vehicle owners that have purchased their vehicle in the past decade. While we don't necessarily have the 50 years of data that NVCS can tout, we have been trending this stuff since 2017. So it's interesting, while your study is based on fresh purchasers and their more recent habits, Navigator is going to be looking at more of a general sample base and just the ideas of what the general public is thinking about when it comes to these emerging trends in the industry. Now, alone, both of these have plenty of insights, but together, I think we're going to be able to weave together a pretty compelling story for you.
Yeah, definitely. And I can't stress enough that we're really just scratching the surface here for both these studies. There's a lot of data, in both of these, and even on this topic of BEVs. So we're really just showing you a small portion of what we have.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's start with who is buying and considering a BEV. And then we're going to take a look at where we're seeing the most and the least growth, and how consideration has been trended, and then who can be targeted for growth. Okay, so taking a look at the data, we know that BEV sales were just shy of 8% of all sales in 2023. And we've been seeing slow, steady growth, a couple points a year for the past 3 or 4 years. But what stands out here is that the younger cohort groups are starting to increase their purchasing exponentially. So that top line there, the millennials, 14% of their vehicle sales were BEVs, which was an increase of almost 6 points from the previous year. Gen X, right below that, is at 11%, and they saw a 5-point gain in 2023. And this compares to just 6 to 7% for the boomers, who had more modest gains year over year. So where we're seeing the growth is in the younger folks. This means that their increases are really ultimately going to drive the growth. The millennials are the second largest cohort group, just behind boomers. So as they become a larger share of vehicle sales, as they start aging, the BEV share should increase more rapidly each year than it is currently. Okay, so where does this electrified business come from? In NVCS, we see that almost half the PHEV and BEV buyers are coming out of a gas vehicle, but 27% of them don't dispose of any vehicle when they make their purchase. And this means that they're either adding to their fleet or they're first-time buyers. So 8% of the BEV, PHEV buyers are first-time buyers, but BEV owners are also often adding to their fleet at a higher rate compared to the gas buyers. So we have two extremes here. We have the younger first-time buyers, like what we saw in the previous slide, and then we have those who can afford to get a new car without trading anything in.
Yeah, and I think that latter group is really interesting because the people who aren't trading anything in, right, the ones that aren't disposing of vehicle, and they're getting the EV, it's almost like a contingency plan, right? In case the BEV experience goes south, they still have that old gas vehicle, the tried and true technology that they're used to. So they kind of are making sure that they've got a best case and worst case scenario ready for them.
Yep, and or even like the commuter vehicle versus the long trips vehicle.
That's right. So that's where BEV adoption stands thus far. But what about consideration in the future, right? And especially when we're talking about the general public of car buyers, we're seeing a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, things have stalled a bit. We saw a lot of growth from 2020 to 2022. But from 2022 onwards, we've been virtually flat. This year, we're at 48% of future consideration for a battery electric vehicle. And that's despite the best efforts of the industry and the government to push forward with BEV ownership and consideration. On the other hand, I think it should also be noted that despite the pummeling it's gotten in the media since the beginning of 2024, flat consideration isn't that bad of a trend. And this was fielded in March of 2024. So people were aware of the negative press it was getting. So I think it goes to show that people haven't necessarily soured on BEVs. We're just not seeing that growth that we want or that we expect. I think a quick note about where that 48% is, we've got a lot of ways to cut that 48%, but I'll tell you now that it's definitely driven by younger generations. The millennials and Gen Z are carrying that figure with about 7 in 10 top two box consideration.
Yeah, that's just further support of what we saw a couple slides ago when we looked at the younger buyers and the fact that the Gen Z buyers might not have been able to buy a BEV yet due to the cost or maybe the inability to charge at their apartment, but they're definitely interested.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when it comes to the reasons of why they're considering BEVs, a lot of it has been driven by environmental benefits. We ask a bevy of reasons for and against consideration, but if we're talking about the pros column for a second, the top responses all have to do with environmental sustainability, whether it's limiting pollution, saving fuel resources, reducing carbon footprints, using renewable energy, and kind of piggybacking on the idea of the younger consumer. They're the ones that are more environmentally conscious in the aggregate versus older consumers. But how far that will go in carrying us towards that 30 to 56% BEV projection, I think it remains to be seen. So we've looked at the pros. Now let's talk about the cons, right? What's actually holding up adoption? And can we kind of shift that momentum and get some of that back? What are the top concerns? And then what's the sales experience? What's hindering adoption in that space?
Okay, so the biggest issue facing the industry is getting the gas buyers to make that switch. The vast majority of gas buyers aren't even cross-shopping outside of their, of a gas vehicle. So only 9% of gas buyers cross-shop something other than a gas vehicle. And this is leading to really slow growth of just a couple points a year. And when gas buyers do cross-shop outside of gas, they're most likely looking at an HEV, with just 2% of gas buyers even cross-shopping a BEV.
Yeah, and that data point on gas buyers being reluctant makes sense, because when we look at the top concerns in Navigator and what people are concerned about when it comes to BEVs, it's all about the battery. You can see those top 5: battery life, recharging time, driving range, battery pack replacement cost, too few public charging stations. Affordability is a middling concern, but when it comes to people actually being worried about battery electric vehicles, it's always about the technology. The top one there, battery life, what we're talking about there isn't necessarily the juice, so to speak. That's more range. What we're talking about is the ability to remain efficient over time, to hold on to a charge over time, and how long it's operable before it needs to be replaced. The other note about this that I want to bring up is that the concerns aren't necessarily increasing drastically since last year. Again, despite the headlines that we've been seeing every day, right? So the woes can't necessarily be understated because these are large figures and they remain the main barriers to adoption. But it's nice to see that it's not necessarily increasing. But until batteries are more of a solved concept, it's going to be hard to get adoption in a better place.
Yeah, and I'll add to that at least some of this is perception. The lack of charging stations and the perceived, inability to charge at home are real issues that we see in the data. A full quarter of gas vehicle buyers who avoided BEVs said it was because they can't charge at home. But yet the data also shows that the vast majority of them live in a single family dwelling where they can in fact charge at home. So there's a clear disconnect here. Okay, so another area of concern is at the dealership. The data shows that the dealers are falling short as an important source of information for BEV buyers, with just 9% of them indicating that it's their top source of information. So for all other buyers, the salesperson is the top source at 17%. Traditionally, the salesperson is the top source of information, but not so for BEVs. So clearly there's room for dealer education.
Yeah, and you can see there, we removed Tesla there mainly because they don't actually have dealerships, right? So it's alarming that even when you exclude them, the figure is under double digits.
Yeah, I think it was 5% when I had Tesla included, and I thought, okay, let's take them out of the equation for obvious reasons since they don't have the dealer network. And then, it goes up to 9%, but nowhere near that 17% for other buyers. So instead, word of mouth is often the top source of information for BEV vehicle purchases, more so than any other fuel type. Almost a quarter of BEV buyers indicated that word of mouth is their top source of information, compared to 15 to 19% for other fuel types. So they're turning to their friends and family way more often than they're turning to the dealership salesperson because they're short on information from their salesperson. They're looking to other sources.
Yeah, we see something similar in Navigator. We ask BEV owners if they would recommend a battery electric vehicle to friends or family, and almost unanimously, they said that they would recommend one. So there is advocacy, right? And that seems to be picking up the slack left by the dealers, which is a good thing, but it's not ideal.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's not a bad thing that they like to talk about their vehicles. But there's definitely information lacking from the dealerships. And then continuing on this topic of dealerships, when we look at the dealership experience, gas buyers report much higher satisfaction. It's not even close. Half the gas buyers are completely satisfied with their sales experience, and 61% of them are completely satisfied with their salesperson. So these measures are a full 10 points lower for the BEV buyers. And, we know that there's a lack of required service that's hindering maybe the enthusiasm of the dealers. And also we think there's probably a huge training gap. But if the OEMs want the vehicles to move off the lots, they need to address this in one way or another. So as an example, 1/3 of non-Tesla BEV owners say that no one at the dealership explained the different charging options. So there's definitely, I guess, a lack of information coming from the dealers, and then that's leading to low satisfaction. Okay, so what else might be holding up BEV adoption?
Well, you touched a lot on the dealer side of things, but in our upfront section, we also mentioned that the government's been involved in this push for adoption as well. And one of the barriers that we're seeing is that this push isn't really helping as much as we expected. The Inflation Reduction Act came out last year, and it extended and updated the incentives, not just for BEVs, but also for plug-in hybrids. But what we've seen in the data is it's been far from easy for consumers to determine what vehicles are eligible or which ones qualify, since it's been a moving target. This is somewhat a fault of the way that it's been written, but it's also a fault of the dealers and OEMs or anyone who should be leveraging this kind of initiative to advertise and say, hey, this vehicle is cheaper now. It's more affordable. Come take a look. Instead, the IRA has been doing better things in the consumer's mind when it comes to like the economical or agenda side. It's viewpoints on creating clean energy jobs and investing in economy score much higher than the actual adoption pieces of things, which is somewhat good news, right? But it's not necessarily how you're getting people excited about BEVs. And while we're on the subject of kind of this government insertion, it's actually been a two-pronged approach to push people into BEVs. And it hasn't necessarily been welcome. We talk about that push versus pull for battery electric vehicles, right? Right now, it seems more of a trying to force people into them versus enticing them with the attractive enough offers to get them excited about it. And we asked our 2,000 respondents in Navigator about this attitude regarding the push to promote electrification. I took all the open-end responses from that, input them into our Ipsos Facto AI tool, and I asked that tool to condense the common themes and insights. Now, this is word for word what it came up with, and it's not necessarily good news, right? There's the ideas of government overreach, preference for letting the market dictate growth versus regulation dictating it, concerns about what it means from a social equality standpoint, which I found interesting. And of course, the fact that the charging infrastructure isn't necessarily ready. And that one is a real kind of cart before the horse moment. I did ask it a few follow-up questions about the government overreach specifically. And we did see some positive sentiment, about a quarter applauding the actions, especially from a sustainability standpoint. That was one of the top answers. But again, if you're looking at the negatives, it's about 40%, so much higher in terms of the sentiment of the comment. And the main themes there were focusing on disregard for consumer choice and the hunch that some other agendas were at play.
Yeah, ultimately, the consumers are going to be the ones to decide, that the EV is better for them, regardless of any government push. So as we've seen, some of the concerns are legitimate, some are just a matter of perception. And that's where the education part comes in.
Definitely. So, Renee, with all that said, let's talk about how to get people back in the driver's seat of these BEVs. What do we know about them now, and what do we know about that likely future BEV owner?
Okay, so what else do we know about our customers? It's important to understand, why they buy what they buy. So when we take a look at purchase reasons out of NVCS, first of all, price deal is always near the top. We're at the top, regardless of really just about anything, but including fuel type. That's mostly the purchase reason that people are indicating. But when we look at the differences in purchase reasons between the gas and the BEV buyers, we see that the dealership experience is one of the top purchase reasons for gas buyers, but it's way down the list for BEV buyers. And it's not necessarily that they don't value that experience, but just as we saw earlier, they're not getting a good experience, and it's not leading them to buy the vehicle. So this is a potential upside for whichever OEMs want to take it on. On the other hand, the BEVs are more often bought because they're fun to drive. And that struck me because we all know that gas buyers often want a vehicle that is fun as well. So, promoting this fun aspect of BEVs will draw the gas buyers to consider them. And then, of course, the BEV buyers are purchasing more for environmental friendliness.
Yeah, that last one also makes sense to me because we saw earlier that BEV considerers, the future considerers, are looking at environmental reasons as a main reason for BEV consideration. So that's something that I'm sure is going to continue to hold true. But what about the next BEV buyers, right? How are they different from current buyers?
Okay, so here we're taking a look at our attitudinal segment in NVCS. And this is a variable that helps us understand our buyers based on their responses to different questions. We're placing them in a group based on their attitudes and their viewpoints. So what I did here is I pulled out 3 of those groups: safe and low cost, basic transportation, and buy best for me. And I pulled these 3 out for a couple reasons. Number one, they're considering but rejecting a BEV more than any of the other 6 groups in relation to how often they buy the BEV, as you can see there by the difference in the red bar versus the blue bar. And then number 2, combined, they make up over 40% of the market. So it's a huge group. Now, if you look over to the right, you can see the characteristics of each of those groups, and then you can start to understand why they're reluctant to pull the trigger even after considering the BEV. They want exceptional service. They rely heavily on salespeople, right? These are all things that we saw earlier that are lacking for the BEV purchase experience. They want simple transportation. They might perceive the BEV as too technical. They keep their vehicles for a long time. They want their vehicles to outlast their payments. And they want to know that that's going to be the case for a BEV. So you can start to understand their rejection here. These are the ones that got away. So remember, they considered, they took the time to investigate, but then ultimately they decided to go with a gas vehicle. And incidentally, they're buying mostly small and mid SUVs.
Yeah, and the percentages you see there, +4, +3, +2, those are the biggest increases across all of the segments. And that 11% or 13%, none of these percentages may seem huge, but we've got 9 segments within your study, right? So I think it shows that even these small increases are actually pretty big shifts when it comes to the different attitudes that these two groups have. And remember that these two groups have a ton in common. You just mentioned the only difference between these people really is that they considered and bought or considered and didn't. So every percentage increase among these two very similar groups is important.
Yeah, and just the sheer volume, a small percentage means a lot of sales.
That's right, exactly. Among Navigator respondents, we have a question here that talks about people who don't think that BEVs currently meet their budget and needs, but might consider one in the next few years. And what we have is a blueprint towards earning their consideration. And these aren't necessarily mindset issues like what Renee was showing, but they're issues that are literally stopping people from being ready for BEVs right now. Longer battery ranges, lower prices, faster charging times, bigger incentives. You can see a lot of these are kind of tied together and can be, tackled almost 2 at a time. If you give bigger incentives, you'll have lower prices. The alarming one to me here is the charging infrastructure, right? Because ranges and prices have been very apparent basically since the beginning of the BEV, and it's easy to quantify and track that progress as maybe the prices decrease or the ranges increase. You can see those numbers over time changing. Charging availability, though, that's not as quantifiable. You've got the hard number for charging stations, but are they in the right place? Are they in the right place for you, the consumer? Can the grid handle things? It's way harder to determine, and you can see people starting to realize that as BEV owners start to grapple with that. You can see that's a 6% increase year over year for increased charging infrastructure. That's the largest increase out of all the reasons that we have for this question. So we got to get the infrastructure ready first before we really push hard for that all-electric future.
Right. The in-home chargers are a huge part of the solution, but that requires the infrastructure as well to support them.
Yeah, that's right. So Renee, we've got the path forward for BEVs, but there's something more tantalizing here that we've kind of been teasing when it comes to electrification, and that's hybrids and plug-in hybrids. What are you seeing?
Okay, so let's talk about that realistic gateway towards meeting increased BEV acceptance. We talked earlier about the BEV cross-shopping, and I showed you that just 2% of gas buyers are cross-shopping a BEV when making their purchase. However, 23% of PHEV buyers are cross-shopping a BEV, and that's almost a quarter. And 7% of HEV buyers are considering a BEV, way more than gas buyers. So the data is suggesting that the path forward is through HEVs and PHEVs.
We see it in Navigator too. You can see there's so much focus on pushing for BEVs that I feel like we lost sight of the fact that according to our data, people are more open to considering HEVs and plug-in hybrids, which tout the same benefits and technology that BEVs do. I mean, 66% top 2 box consideration for hybrids, 52% for plug-in hybrids, versus that 48%. You just got to follow the numbers. And doesn't that seem like a more natural progression that we should have followed from the start? I mean, if you look at this data point here is the watershed moment to me. 58% of BEV considerers think that plug-in hybrids are a better option for them. So while the automotive industry and all of its players and the government have been pushing these people into BEVs as the solution, over half of them would rather be in a plug-in hybrid first. And once either they, the consumer, or their friends and family are more comfortable with the battery tech, or until the battery tech and the infrastructure innovates to a better point where everyone's more comfortable, this transition should be much smoother because these behaviors have been primed through the ownership of a plug-in hybrid.
Yeah, and then I took a look at PHEV disposers because I was curious about what they were purchasing. So PHEV disposers are way more likely to move to a BEV than to go, I guess, to go back, if you could say, to a gas vehicle. So we could move the needle a lot quicker if we got people into PHEVs.
That's right. And what moves the needle for these people, if we're looking deeper into that 58%, right? All of these people that I'm going to be talking about are BEV considerers, but this 58% are people that I'd call PHEV curious BEV considerers, and how they differ from those that really are more interested in BEVs over PHEVs. Well, the demographics are actually very similar, but the attitudes they carry, that's where the difference is. And even more so, they match the sentiment that those BEV rejectors you noted earlier actually mentioned. They're more practical, they're more utilitarian, they want basic transportation. So what that means is these BEV rejectors may have been more comfortable buying PHEVs. So why didn't they? Well, people don't know much about them comparatively. 31% said that they know a fair amount about PHEVs. That's lower than both HEVs and BEVs. People know more about HEVs mainly because they've been in the industry for a couple decades now, and BEVs, of course, people are familiar with because there was that big push. But plug-in hybrids have been forgotten about, and it shouldn't be this way. There's a lack of education, a lack of awareness. Untapping that could be the key to advancing this adoption for all of electrification, not just the BEVs, but anything that has a more fuel-efficient powertrain.
Yeah, and to kind of put an exclamation point on this, NVCS shows that the top reason for avoiding a PHEV is never heard of the vehicle. And 74% of the PHEV avoiders report being not at all familiar with the PHEV that they avoided. So there's a clear problem here with, just knowing that these vehicles are out there and knowing something about them. Okay, so we mentioned that we could only scratch the surface on these two studies, but we also have a lot that we can take away. So let's do a quick review. Sorry. Okay, so battery electric vehicles are continuing to grab the headlines, but BEV ownership is up and future consideration is level, even though we've had all this harsh rhetoric. The gas buyers are not cross-shopping for BEVs. They're concerned about battery life, range, charging infrastructure. There's very little information coming out about BEVs from the dealership, despite strong promotion from the OEMs themselves. Consumers feel pressured by the OEMs and from the government to adopt BEVs, and that's really ineffective. The big group of potential owners are more focused on basic transportation and less focused on all the gadgetry. And they need knowledgeable, enthusiastic salespeople. Rather than BEV, more people are willing to consider HEVs and PHEVs for their next vehicle, but low familiarity with the PHEVs is keeping them off the radar of these people.
Mm-hmm. So what does this all mean, right? Like what has to happen? Well, number one, I think there is a course correct that has to happen, right? Because the scrutiny in the media is going to continue to halter this future consideration and market share. It's okay to course correct, but I think we need to make sure that we're deliberate and confident in our next actions. Number two is the OEMs and the dealers have to listen to each other, right? There can't be a discrepancy between these two parties. They rely on each other. They're going to continue to rely on each other, but right now there's a disconnect. It's got to be profitable for the dealers to actually sell these BEVs, but they also need to see the long-term goal as well. They can't just be chasing after the short-term profits of selling the same stuff that they have been. Number three is you got to listen to the consumer. And I know this sounds silly and self-explanatory, but for some reason, it's not really happening. Consumers are dictating the future of the market and they've made their voice heard. And if they continue to disagree with these outside forces, you're going to lose the momentum and you're going to lose their trust. Number four, focusing on limiting anxieties, right? The next generation of PHEV and BEV owners want no disruption to their usual routine that they currently have with their gas vehicle. So every bit of anxiety, the range, the charging availability, the price, it's limiting their intention to buy electric. And this last one, number 5, don't skip straight ahead to BEVs. We can focus on attracting people to electrification by making attractive HEVs and PHEVs. And if you act on this, I feel like you've achieved all 5 of these items. You'll course correct, you'll have dealers selling vehicles that are more palatable to sell. You'll be aligning your fleet better to customer consideration figures and promoting consumer choice, and you'll get them comfortable in an electrified vehicle. You're going to relieve those concerns and prime them for an all-electric future down the road. All right, we're going to move into the Q&A session with the remaining time we have, but I do want to invite Mike back into the room to join us, and he's going to facilitate that Q&A session as he's been monitoring all the questions submitted by you.
Yeah,
Mike?
Thanks, Graham. Thanks, Renee. Great information, great insights. I hope everybody's really seeing the value of the information that we're being able to share with you today. Couple of things. One, if there are questions that are being submitted, that's great. So I'm kind of going through them. If you haven't seen the Q&A button, if you have a question, there's a Q&A button that you can click on, submit your question that way, and it'll feed my way. But before we get into the Q&A, I just wanted to touch a little bit on the 2 studies that we've been really highlighting information from today as part of this conversation. So NVCS, the New Vehicle Customers Study, is a staple within the auto industry. It's been around for 50 years, and it's really looking at those early experiences people are having when they purchase or acquire a new vehicle. But as you saw in today's talk, it goes well beyond just the vehicle they purchased. It looks at what did they dispose of, what did they reject in that process of shopping, and why are they avoiding certain brands or models. It looks at the fleet within the home, and a lot of information that went into the whole process of making that decision and that early experience of owning that vehicle. And we can hone in on BEVs and PHEVs and HEVs, which we have today, but it also extends to the entirety of the market. We've also been highlighting very much the Navigator study, which we mentioned earlier is really a 3-part study. This is the electrification portion that we've been sharing with you. Later in the year. We'll be publishing our driver technology module and also the shared mobility module. And I think Steve early on kind of showed you those dates. You're already registered for those, so that's great. The Navigator study is really a look at these 3 particular topics and what do consumers think of them. Are they embracing these new technologies? Do they have concerns with them? It's fielded in the US, which is what we've been focusing on today, but it's also fielded in other markets as well. One additional aspect to it is we have a qualitative module, which or tack on, if you will, called Automotives. Great name, wasn't mine. I'm very jealous, but I think it's such a great name. But it really is an exploration or sort of a look deeper into some of the topics around the quantitative data that we've collected on these particular studies. So if you're looking for more information on these studies, you can reach out. I want to point out that while we've been very focused on OEM specific topics and a little bit with the dealer as well, there is really great relevant information in here that would benefit the auto suppliers, tech companies that are working with the auto industry in different ways, government agencies, infrastructure, those that are involved in infrastructure, the electric company, of course, charging networks, and much, much more. So depending on the space you're in and how you're looking at it, there's a good chance that there's a lot of great value in here. We've just scratched the surface with what we've shared with you today. There's so much more that we can dive into. So you can always reach out to myself, to Graham, or to Renee. We're happy to engage with you and talk a little bit about it. With that, let's jump into a couple of questions. So I'm going to start out with a few here. And if we don't get to your questions, because I know we have about 15 minutes left or so, we will answer them separately on, through email. But I'll try to touch on a few. There were several that came in, but I'm going to start with a question around living arrangements. So depending on where somebody lives, like do they own or rent? What area? Is it urban? Is it rural? Whatever it might be. How does this affect the EV ownership, or for that matter, just even EV consideration in general? So I'll throw it up to either one of you.
Yeah, go. I'll start. We have both those sets of variables in NVCS. We have like whether they live in like metro, urban, small town, farming community, and we see that the small towns and the farming community folks are much more reluctant than the metro and the suburban dwellers, to get an EV. We see differences in the way that they charge. There's a lot we can dig into. We started down that path a little bit as we were putting this all together, and then kind of had to narrow it to get to our points. But yeah, it is interesting when you look at the makeup of the people who consider, the people who buy, the people who disposed.
Very good.
I feel like that's going to be the theme of the Q&A is going to be, yeah, we looked into that, but we had to kind of move back for the time constraints. We also have the same type of data cuts in Navigator. Definitely both BEV owners and BEV considerers, of course, the latter being a larger group. They're more likely to live in urban environments, whether it's major metro or smaller metro. And I think it's interesting. There's also a difference between like the differences in charging, especially if they rent or they're unable to, have their own level 2 charger. But I think in the urban environments, range is much less of an issue for them because it's this densely populated area, and your point A to point B is taking fewer interstates or your other destination might be just around the corner.
Great, thank you. Renee, you had mentioned in part of your talk around people that were buying but not disposing. So it was an extension to their garage. Mm-hmm. One of the questions that came in was really some interest around, and curious if we have information on it, about when they do that, when they're not disposing, and that vehicle that was maybe the one they were driving as part of their family fleet. Do we have any information on who is driving that vehicle now, or any information in terms of primary driver for vehicles in a family fleet?
We do have information on whether the vehicle that you purchased, whether it's your primary vehicle or whether it's a secondary vehicle. We have data on what you did with your disposed vehicle, whether you traded it in or, junked it or gave it away or whatever. Tell me the second part of that again. Repeat that, please.
It was really understanding if you're adding to your fleet of BEV, then what happens to the vehicle that you already had, and is curiosity about passing it down to other family members.
Yeah, so yeah, that's part of basically the disposal. So yeah, there's a little bit around that as far as that goes. Yes.
Okay. Graham, you just kind of mentioned a little bit about driving range. So here's one I think somewhat related. So I'm just going to read it verbatim. As it was submitted. So Americans drive on average less than 40 miles a day. Why do you think there's a disconnect between reality and the focus on BEV range? Is it because on rare occasion people want to make that long trip and they purchase based on those edge cases?
I think it's a bit of the edge cases. I also think it's just the idea that when your gas tank gets low, we've had nearly a century of these gas companies strategically positioning so that you never have to have anxiety about running out of a full tank, versus the charging stations. If you are out and about, I think it takes a lot more effort and a lot more knowledge of the area to know where to go for a charging station. Because you're right, the 40 miles a day shouldn't be that much of an issue, especially for people who are charging at home or charging at work, which are the main two places that we see people charging. But anxiety doesn't come from the daily routine. Anxiety is usually coming from what you had mentioned, the edge cases or the disruption to their usual routine.
Right.
The weekend trips.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. There's a few questions that have come in somewhat similar, so I'm going to kind of combine them. So one thought is around the whole notion of EV chargers, home or public, and the impact on buying an EV. But then also, if you're charging in public, and that's an issue, as we've somewhat discussed, where do BEV owners currently charge? Like what does that mix look like?
So I think I just mentioned it's mainly home and work. it's not necessarily an option for everyone, and that could be a reason that consideration is stalling. I think it might be a bit of a chicken or egg situation, right? Are they charging at home and work because those are the easiest places to charge, or did they buy a BEV because they knew that they had chargers at work and they had the ability to at home? I don't necessarily know, but for what it's worth, what we do see for current BEV owners is they're not really charging in public or like at a gas station or a convenience store as much as non-owners would expect. So again, it's more about the routine places that keeps the juice in the car for the most part, and then using public when they need to.
Yeah, I was surprised at the number or the high percentage of people who use home chargers that live in like a condo or a shared duplex. I feel like these places are coming up with ways so that people can charge at home, probably more so in urban areas, as there's a need. I was surprised at the number of people who lived in apartments that are charging at home somehow. It was like 30% are able to charge at home. So I think that infrastructure is getting moved into place organically, not because of any push or incentives or whatever, but it's just happening organically.
Mm-hmm. It makes good sense for apartment buildings to almost market themselves as BEV friendly, right? And the same goes for retail stations, or retail places of different industries where it makes sense. That can easily be, a selling point that brings people of that type to your business.
Another question. This one's about charging networks. So Tesla has invested significantly into the charging networks. Do you see other OEMs or fuel companies making investments to expand charging infrastructure?
Well, I think what's actually funny is that they've consolidated the charging infrastructure, right? It started even last year where you saw a lot of team ups of different OEMs joining Tesla in using their charging infrastructure so that we can have a more unified, port and system. It kind of harkens back to the days of think a couple of decades ago when we all had mobile phones, but they all had completely different chargers, and it was an absolute pain if you needed a charge. Whereas now, not only do we have mainly two types of chargers, but even in Europe, they're pushing iPhone to switch to USB-C. So the more people that we can have on a unified charging standard, which is what's currently happening, relying on Tesla systems, I think the better off we're going to be, and the better off they're going to be, because it takes one less thing that other OEMs have to worry about.
Another question. This is really about adoption. So the question states, historically, the diffusion of innovation kind of accelerates once you hit sort of this 5% mark, because you start to get social proof in the viability of the innovation. And that grows through various means: experience with the product, talking to somebody who's a trusted advisor, word of mouth, whatever it might be. That first 5% share, EVs have already earned. Right, so we know that we've hit those milestones. But do you foresee that acceleration then at this point in the EV space?
I think we see it because of younger people, because we see what their growth is. It's going up exponentially. The older groups, I don't know that we're going to see a whole lot of change. But as you said, once it takes off, and like that 5%, that's interesting, because we're at 7.5, or and we're not seeing that like across the board. But there's so many other variables in play right now. There's the politics of it, and
Sure.
Go ahead, Graham.
No, I was just going to say we did see it was 5.5% last year, though. So we kind of just
That's true.
And maybe we're about to see it. I think it remains to be seen.
Yeah.
The one thing I feel like I'd caution people against is the echo chamber on whatever side of the fence you sit on, because Mike, to your point, right, the proof of concept or the disproof of concept that to meet your needs, I think the people that aren't considering BEVs are not just BEV rejectors, but just don't think that the technology is going to take off, are going to talk to other people in that way and never believe that way. So their line is going to stay pretty flat. Versus, to Renee's point, the younger consumers that are more interested in it and might have the word of mouth from their peers, well, it's going to take off there just because their echo chamber is saying that is going to be the future and that it's a good experience.
Yeah, and two, I'm just kind of recall some of what you shared earlier too. This sort of iterative step of PHEVs in particular, even HEVs, which have been around a long time. For those that weren't necessarily the first marketers that are going to go right to BEVs, regardless, that was just who they are attitudinally and the way they act. It's maybe more of a step-by-step process to dip your toe in the water with the PHEV, just to kind of experience what electrification life is like. And then, Renee, as you pointed out, that next product then oftentimes is that BEV, right? So they're kind of progressing. And I think maybe that's sort of that acceleration, but for the masses, it needs to go in more of an iterative step as opposed to straight to BEV.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Renee, you kind of mentioned the younger consumers, and I know you shared some data on that. There was a question about Gen Alpha, so the next generation,
Okay.
going to be drivers being about 2 years away. Do we have, or have we seen any kind of information that says that these are going to be people who are really the future of EV?
Yeah, so that wouldn't be NVCS because you know you have to be the driver of the vehicle. So we don't have anything around that. But that I don't know, Graham, what you think about that. I'm sure there's secondary information out there.
Yeah,
We don't have it in our data.
Navigator we don't either because our sample base is I think 18 years
Right.
old, 74. So we haven't necessarily touched on that yet. I think to Renee's point earlier about the disposing of the vehicle, one of the first questions that we had mentioned, maybe their first car is a gas because mom and dad are getting a PHEV or a BEV, and you know Junior gets the older gas car. I don't necessarily have sentiment around that. The only thing I could say is my hunch is looking at how the different generations have had increased consideration that I'd be pretty bullish on them considering it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I agree.
So I'm just kind of scrolling through and I know we only have like a few minutes left, so let's see if we can get a little more in. What proportion, this is actually coming from one of the board members, what proportion of EV owning households are exclusively EV, meaning they are not a mixed garage?
Yeah, I could tell you that, but not in 3 minutes. I bet I could tell you that in 4 minutes because we definitely have that. So yeah, off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you, but that's exactly the type of thing that we can easily get to.
Yeah, as we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of depth in these studies, and
Yeah.
it's a great question, of course, to
It
really
is.
see who all bought in completely versus, you know, I kind of maintain that balance. You know, a lot
Yeah.
of people, and this goes back to that long range, you know, those edge kind of drives that you have to take, which are, you know, beyond sort of that normal 40-mile, that maybe you keep a gas vehicle for that reason because you're not confident in those long ranges yet.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. We have the whole household makeup of vehicles.
great.
And I've probably run that 20 times for different clients or you know, as we're going through analysis. But yeah, we've got that out there. I don't know it off the top of my head.
All right, so that's a promise for the person who asked that question, that we will follow up with some more concrete details. So I think we're pretty much at time. I just wanted to say thank you for all of you for joining us. Wonderful, the amount of attendance, the questions, there's a lot we didn't get to. We will get to those. And certainly we look forward to you joining us in July for the driver technology study. And then also again in, was it November, if I remember correctly, for the shared mobility. So again, thank you very much. We will follow up with all of you that were registered with a recording in case you want to revisit this. And again, if you have any questions, you want to talk in any more detail, please reach out to me directly. I am as my role is a point of first contact, but also you can reach out directly to Graham and Renee. They'd be happy to talk to you as well. So with that, again, thank you very much, and you have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.